I've entitled this session, The Next Great Leader. Albert Pike died April 2nd, 1891. We covered the fragile decade after Pike last month. You will recall that the position of Grand Commander was held by three old men, two of whom were in poor health when they began their short periods in office. The third, Thomas Caswell of California, actually served for 6 years and can be given credit for the southern jurisdiction's rapid expansion into the western states because of his headquarters in California. However, none of these exhibited any degree of charismatic leadership like came from the 31 years of Albert Pike. So a degree of instability was present in the Supreme Council during those years. And of course we mentioned that the amazing thing is that notwithstanding the instability, the Scottish Rite had seen its greatest spurt in membership growth in its 100-year history. In 1891, when Pike died, we had 4,000 members. And in 2000, when Caswell died, we had 10,000 members. Most of this growth had come from the new emerging states west of the Mississippi. The increase in the eastern part of the country was quite modest, and indeed was negligible in the Confederate or southern states, as they were still digging out from the ravages of the Civil War, even though that was 35 years previous. This subject was highlighted at the end of last month's talk, but I want to mention it again. It'll come up again even in tonight's talk. There was still a minority of members who reflected, I'm talking about Supreme Council members, there was still a minority who reflected Pike's perspective about the Scottish Rite as a Masonic elite organization, and who were apprehensive about this rapid growth and expansion. We will now focus our attention on the Scottish Rite in this new century. First, let's take a geographic look at the United States in 2000. At that time, there were 45 states in the Union, so our basic boundaries were already formed. This left only Oklahoma, Arkansas, Arizona, and New Mexico to enter the Union to finish out the original area, which always seemed destined to form the 48 contiguous states. And of course, as you all know, 50 years later, Alaska and Hawaii were added, so to bring our total to 50. Okay, that's the state of the Union, you might say, geographically speaking. Back to the Scottish Rite. Thomas Caswell, our third Grand Commander after Pike, died November the 13th, 1900, and was succeeded by his Lieutenant Grand Commander, James D. Richardson. Richardson was 58 years old, quite a change from the three previous leaders. He turned out to be the first real charismatic leader since Pike. He was a visionary and had a great gift of organization. Let me give you a quick glance into his background. He was a native of Tennessee, and while attending school at Franklin College, the Civil War began. He enlisted in the 45th Tennessee Volunteer Regiment, serving as an officer until the war ended. Thereafter, he became an attorney. Then he served in the state legislature, and then was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1884, and served for 20 continuous years. Now, 1884 was a banner year for Mr. Richardson, because that same year he was appointed by Mr. Pike that's in 1884, to the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite. And of course, here he was taken over in 1900 as the Grand Commander. And so he served for 4 years more in Congress after he took over as Grand Commander. This joint duty was quite beneficial to the Supreme Council as he was instrumental in the following. He helped the right to receive a special charter of incorporation from Congress, which, matter of fact, is still in place. He helped with the purchase of land for the old expansion of the old temple, and then also when the new temple came along. While a member of the Supreme Council, he was the one who proposed a statue of Albert Pike, and then, through his efforts in Congress, got the approval for the statue, and then, through his efforts, received approval for the specific location for the statue. Richardson was well prepared for his reign as Grand Commander, as he had served on the Supreme Council with Pike for 7 years, and then was present during this fragile decade following Pike's death. As mentioned, James D. Richardson assumed this position of Grand Commander in November of 1900. His first action after assuming command was to change the upcoming centennial celebration from its scheduled date in May of 2001. You'll recall that the Scottish Rite dates this beginning to May the 31st, 1801 in Charleston. So they had set the centennial celebration for May of 2001. And so he decided that he wanted to change that from May and move it back to October. And this was his reasoning. He said it would save money. He said that it would give an assurance of a better attendance, and then it would also allow him more time to prepare for the centennial, even though planning for the event had begun 4 years earlier during Caswell's tenure. This historic biennial of 2001 began with the customary allocution by the new Grand Commander Richardson. He began his talk with these words: "There was never a time in the history of the Supreme Council when the right was more prosperous and buoyant with hope than it is today." This optimism was, of course, caused by the rapidly expanding membership and income. His great admiration for Albert Pike then surfaced, because immediately following that opening statement, he comes back to that old statement and warns the members that he also was concerned about whether this great influx of new members was in the best interest of the right. And then he admonishes everybody to be very vigilant in the accepting of petitions. Probably the highlight of the 2001 session was the unveiling of the statue of Albert Pike. You'll recall back last month, we mentioned that in 1897, this statue was commissioned by the Supreme Council, and so by 4 years later, it was ready to be for the unveiling. So, let's see. So the unveiling of the statue of Albert Pike was the highlight. At the end of the dedicatory address, the statue was presented to the government of the United States. And in his acceptance of the statue, the federal official observed this, quote, "Although Albert Pike was a soldier in the Civil War, this statue will commemorate him rather as a victor in the honorable rivalries of peace," end of quote. Now, the author, William Fox, of this history that I get most of my material from, said that this was a very tactful comment about a former Confederate general. And a lot of the Southern people and the Confederates took great pride in the fact that the statue of a Confederate general was placed in Washington, D.C. And even Don, in his minutes, if you'll notice, is the only general. Well, the federal official made it a point to mention that the statue would not have been commissioned and okayed by Congress if this was because he was a Confederate general. It was because of his activities thereafter. So this really is not a point for people to point to with pride. Let me back up here and focus on some U.S. history, which is appropriate for the subject at hand. William McKinley was in the beginning months of his second term as president in this year of 2001. In September, a month before the 2000 biennial meeting that we've just been talking about, he was assassinated. He was the third president in 36 years who had been shot and killed. Of course, the others were Lincoln, Garfield, and then McKinley. He was succeeded by Theodore Roosevelt. During the historic 2001 meeting, the Supreme Council called on this new president, President Roosevelt. He was a Mason, but not a Scottish Rite member. Grand Commander Richardson, still a member of Congress, if you'll recall at that time, introduced them to Mr. Roosevelt. Now this would never have taken place unless we had had the liaison with Richardson in Congress. Changing degree rituals was another subject matter which was discussed but no action taken, at least in the 2001 session. The Supreme Council was in a difficult position. Changes in degree wordage was brought up primarily because of the great switch from lodge room to stage presentation, which we've talked about in here before. Now, the majority of the Supreme Council still held to Pike's perspective. Of course, we're talking about the Southern jurisdiction now. And so the Supreme Council, the Southern jurisdiction, still basically had the conservative perspective that Pike had, which was no theater. Well, but the theater grew from the grassroots up instead of from Supreme Council down, saying you will do this. It actually started from the ground up. And it became so effective because a lot of this membership growth was attributed to this new presentation of the degrees. So here's the problem with the Supreme Council. They had never authorized theater presentation. It just happened. And they were afraid now to forbid it because it would really create problems. So they didn't do anything. They didn't change the ritual or anything. They just left things as they were. So for the moment, the Supreme Council avoided the changes. However, theatrical presentations were becoming the norm, and some ritual change was instigated at the local levels just to make it easier because, you know, from the stage presentation required a little bit different wordage. Anyway, the 2001 biennial session was very successful, and Grand Commander Richardson started his tenure in a very proper manner. To save time, I'm going to cover the next few years in a rapid manner, mentioning only the most important activities. Let's take 1903 and 1904. The issue of intoxicants became an issue in 1903. There had been some incidents both at the Supreme Council level and down through the subordinate bodies which had caused some embarrassment to the right. On the national level, the movement toward prohibition had begun, and the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, was making a lot of noise, and this was creating an effect on the Supreme Council. Notwithstanding the fact that the Scottish Rite was created in 1801, where? In Shepherd's Tavern in Charleston, and that craft masonry also was begun in a tavern culture. In 1903, all alcoholic beverages were banned in Scottish Rite formal activities from top to bottom, from the Supreme Council down to the rallies. Also, at Richardson's request, the Supreme Council authorized the publishing of a newsletter magazine combination. As far back as Albert Pike, such publications had begun and would go for a while, and then they'd end for various reasons. But this time, Commander Richardson, recognizing that the Rite was expanding rapidly and we needed to be able to communicate better with the expanded membership, he decided we needed this magazine. And so the name given to it was The New Age. And the first issue took place in June of 1904. Let's skip up to the next 2 years, 05 and 06. In March of 1905, Richardson retired from Congress after 20 years of service. Now, because of more recent legislation, members of Congress cannot hold another income-producing job while in office because of Conflict of Interest Act. But that came along after Richardson, so it didn't affect him. So the Scottish Rite was benefited from his dual activities there. So in the biennial session of 1905, listen to this. A payment of $2 was authorized for each 32nd degree conferred in a given orient. And this $2 was to be paid to the SGIG of that orient as expense money. Now, this is Tom talking. This is not the historian. This sounds to me like a little hypocrisy, saying be vigilant in approving petitions and then actually giving a commission for new initiates. That's the way I looked at it. Anyway, in April of 1906, the San Francisco earthquake occurred, causing the loss of hundreds of lives, leaving 300,000 homeless, 28,000 buildings and homes were destroyed. So the Supreme Council promptly sends $25,000 to the California SGIG for relief. This was the largest single donation made by the Supreme Council up to that time. Now, this is interesting, notwithstanding the fact that even back in those days, governmental assistance was very minimal. You know, they didn't have a FEMA and all the kind of stuff like we have right now. But anyway, notwithstanding that, as conditions improved in California, California sent back to the Supreme Council all $25,000 that was sent to them for relief. Now, this was a rare thing back in those days, and I suspect it certainly would not happen at all in these days. Okay, we go on to 1907, 1909. In 1907, the membership continued to rise to 27,000, a phenomenal increase of 34% in the last 2 years. And now, listen to this, the Supreme Council had $230,000 in U.S. bonds in its investment portfolio. So they were in pretty good shape financially. $230,000 in those days, you know, you could magnify it many times right now if you want to put it in current terms. A notation in the Supreme Council minutes of 1909 indicated that all SGIGs should wear their cap. Should wear the cap of their rank at future sessions. And the implication here was that until that time, the cap was just a part of the regalia of the degree and was really not used regularly by individual Masons. Now, I might mention this just as a side issue. It's supposed to be educational in nature, but I know anybody that's been in Scottish Rite for a while has worn their cap, and somebody that's non-Mason has seen it. We've heard some of the comments. It looks like an old-time hotel bellboy or all sorts of things like that. But anyway, the cap comes from two traditions. The style of the cap derives from the British military tradition, and its purpose and nature derives from the Hebrew prayer cap. And so because of the latter, the cap is not removed, as per most headwear is, during prayer or flag salute. Now, I mention this because I noticed at our last society meeting, some of our Masons, when it came time for the prayer and the flag, they took their caps off like you would any other headwear. Well, that's not normally done. Anyway, back to the session. The most important action taken by the Supreme Council in 1909 biennial was that of calling for the enlargement or extension of the present House of the Temple, or for the erection of a new one, and for the Grand Commander to carry out this mandate. Now, to me, the third part of this is what's really interesting, for the Grand Commander to carry out this mandate. This last statement shows to me two things. One, the great respect and admiration of the Supreme Council toward Mr. Richardson, and 2, their recognition of his great organizational skills, because they just turned it over to him. Normally, a project of this magnitude and importance, you would think that you'd require a committee to secure the land, a committee to consult with architects, a finance committee, a building committee, and all those sorts of things. This was not Richardson's style. This was his baby, and he was going to run the show. Richardson had predetermined that he wanted nothing to do with another addition to the old House of the Temple on 3rd Street, because it had been added to many times. And this is my words. It didn't come from the book, but I'm sure what he was thinking was that old building was just another large brownstone building from outward appearance. It had served its purpose for 30 years. And now the organization was growing rapidly and deserved a national headquarters building which reflected a better image. So Sovereign Grand Commander James D. Richardson took over. While in Congress, he had served on the committee to beautify Washington, D.C. And that's the Washington Monument, and Lincoln Memorial, and the mall in between. He was involved in that stuff. So he knew his way around, and the area, had contacts, and so he felt properly prepared to take on this task. Now, in keeping with my promise of limiting these talks to 15 to 20 minutes, and I already know I'm over 20 minutes, so I must bring this to a close. Because in October of 1911, the cornerstone was laid for the original House of the Temple, for the new House of the Temple, I had hoped to cover that in this talk. But I will cover that, the pre-planning of the cornerstone, the laying of the death and the death of Richardson, and the completion of this beautiful structure we now proudly point to as the House of the Temple at the next session. Thank you.